Thank you very much, Professor Williams, for showing us what all we have to do if we want to have in the future an appropriate strategic and other policies. In a way, I think that you have given us an operational policy for this afternoon's discussions, and I think that will be extremely valuable to us. We shall next change the computer. We shall next have the pleasure of listening to Professor Martin Knapp, who is a professor of health economics at the Institute of Psychiatry and a professor of social policy at the London School of Economics. I had the pleasure of working with Professor Knapp on many occasions, and I never ceased to admire his ability to be clear about very complex issues and really proceed, in the words of Dr. Williams, with a value-based and evidence-informed instruction about how we should go about economics in the field of health. Professor Knapp, please.
Thank you very much. I'll just find my slides. Okay. I want to start with 2 words of thanks and 1 word of apology. Firstly, I want to thank Professor Caffo for taking this initiative, for bringing together this group. I think the purpose of today is incredibly important, and I'm really pleased to be part of that. And my second word of thanks is for the personal invitation to bring economics here. And that leads me to my third introductory word, which is to apologise. Norman, in his very early comments, talked about the terrible but necessary topic of economics. So I'm the terrible but necessary speaker today. I hope to be less terrible by the end than I might look at the moment. Now, what I want to do is to look at some of the economic evidence that we have in the area of child and adolescent mental health and what that might imply for a declaration, for an initiative to promote the mental well-being of Europe's children and young people. I'm going to address 5 questions. Firstly, is economics relevant? Secondly and thirdly, to look at economic impacts, both now and in the longer term. Fourthly, I will look at the evidence base on cost effectiveness, and I'll explain what I mean. And then fifthly, to end, just to make some suggestions for what we need to do on the basis of the evidence that I'll present. So, the first question then is why am I here? Why is economics relevant when our primary concern is meeting the needs of children and their families, of promoting their mental well-being? Well, I have a series of slides I'll show you now, which I think I've used before. I think they illustrate where economics connects with the issues that concern you, and clearly connectedness is something that Richard has just been emphasising. On that slide there, I've just put an illustration, not a comprehensive list, some examples of mental health interventions aimed at children and adolescents or aimed at families, therapeutic residential care, multidimensional treatment, foster care, various forms of parent training, and at the bottom there, general child and adolescent mental health services. Now, you could put anything in there. There's a range of child and adolescent services. But what your primary interest is the connection between those things on the left and those things in the middle. And the things in the middle are the outcomes. It's things like secure attachment for children. It's assessing and meeting needs. It's protecting from abuse. It's maximising life chances, and so on. And the connections there, the arrows, that's the evidence base. It might be that some of those arrows aren't yet drawn, but that's what we're hoping to find. We want to know what works on the left-hand side in terms of promoting those outcomes. Now, the space on that slide, and I'm going to jump in and fill that space with a third set of things. And that's what I would call the long-term costs. If your interventions are successful in promoting outcomes, then you will you ought to reduce the longer-term need for support. So children whose needs are met should require fewer health and social care services. There should be fewer contacts with criminal justice agencies. There should be fewer problems with employment when they get to adulthood, and so on. Now, what that picture, very, very simple picture or hypothesis map shows is the potential connections between treatments and outcomes and longer-term savings. It's not a complete picture, but it gives me enough, I think, to show you where economics has relevance in this area. So why is economics relevant? The relevance of economics is scarcity. And I'm afraid I always use this line, but every time Norman introduces me as Professor Knapp, which is how I pronounce my name when I'm not in England, but in England I'm just Knapp. But nap is a short sleep, which I hope you're not having. Knapp in various European languages means scarce. And so scarcity, remember that if nothing else at the end of this presentation. The reason why we're here, the reason why economists are needed is because we don't have enough resources to meet all of society's needs or wants. We have to choose, we have to ration the available resources in order to decide whether to treat this person or that person, whether to pursue that service or that service. And that is the cue, the prompt for cost effectiveness analysis, which I'll come back to in a moment. So why is economics relevant? Because we don't have enough resources. And I can then show you, going back to my previous slide, the questions economists get asked to address. One is, what does it cost? What is the cost of delivering those services? The second would be, if we spend money on the left-hand side, do we save money on the right-hand side? So is there a payoff? Spend money on better services, save money down the track. Thirdly, what is the link between what we spend, what we deliver in services, and what we achieve in terms of outcomes? And that's the cost effectiveness question. That's the most important one. And then fourthly, what economic incentives can we use to persuade people to behave in ways which are more efficient, more equitable, more fair, more appropriate? Okay, so that's, if you like, that's been my agenda for my career. That's what economists are interested in, those questions. And I want to show you some evidence around those questions. So my second question then is, are there economic impacts associated with child and adolescent mental health problems? And I will show you just two examples. There are many others I could have picked. The first one is from a paper published 2 years ago now by a group of people. And what they did was to work with health, education and social services agencies in one city, in Manchester, in England. And they asked the professionals in those services to identify the most complex children, the most complex cases, if you like, in their area. And then the researchers looked at the circumstances, a very simple descriptive study. But what that study found was that those children used a huge range of services. And when I put the cost findings there, what you can see in yellow is about half the cost is from social care, children being in residential or foster placements, having support from social workers. About 2/5, 39%, is education, special education, not regular classroom education, but classroom assistance, problems with special needs and so on. And only a small part, 5%, the blue bit of the pie, is healthcare. So although these children all have complex mental health problems, that was the term used by the researchers, actually only a small part of the cost is falling to the health service. So the first point to note here is that the costs of child mental health problems are wide, they spread across many different areas. This is the second example. This is for children with persistent antisocial behaviour. Effectively, they all have conduct disorder. Now, the difference between this example and the previous one is in this second example, what we did was to look at the family costs as well as the service costs. And you can see that the big slice of pie, the purple slice, is the family cost. That's the cost for families having to give up work or to take on less full-time employment, or out-of-pocket expenses, or damage around the home. Those were the costs that we estimated. In addition, the red bit of pie is the benefits that are paid by the state to those families, primarily in compensation for the needs of the child. Now, there may be some double counting, so be careful of that. But my point with this slide, again, is to say, actually, healthcare is a small part of the total. Now, all of the children, all of the families in this chart, if you like, went on to join a clinical trial. They were all treated using the best psychiatric services that could be provided. So they were all defined as having a mental health need, but mental health was only a small part, or mental health services as conventionally defined was a small part of the total. So my first message then is that the cost impacts of mental health are very broad. Question 3. Are there economic impacts in the longer term, over the life course? And we've heard quite a bit, Matt talked about it, other speakers talked about the importance of looking over the life course when seeking to understand what the consequences are of mental health problems. And I'm going to give you 2 examples which illustrate the significant economic impacts. The first one is what's called the Inner London Longitudinal Study. It's no longer running. Nearly, 1,700 10-year-olds were studied in 1970. This is a Michael Rutter study. Children with non-UK parents were excluded from this study, included another one. All of these children were rated by their teachers and filled in some questionnaires, and then subgroups were studied more intensively. I'm not going to go too much into the design. I want to show you some results. Those children were then followed up at ages 26 to 28. But at that time, there was no intention to do an economic study. And so what we've done is to go back to the data set to pull out the information I'll show you in a moment. And as I say, this was a study which was originally set up by Michael Rutter. Now, what it was possible to do with the intensively studied group was to put them into 5 categories. There are children with no emotional or behavioural problems, children with emotional problems, and children with behavioural, antisocial behavioural or conduct problems. And I'm going to show you the results, or show you some results, for the 3 groups that are in the black font. Children with no problems, children with antisocial problems at school, but they didn't reach the threshold for diagnosis of conduct disorder, and then the group with conduct disorder. And what we did was to look at the services that those children used between the ages of 10 and 28. So I'll show you for the 3 groups. This is the no problem group. Now, you can't really see the detail very easily. The green bit of the column is education, and that's special education, special needs education. As you go up, you've got a little tiny bit of healthcare cost. You've got some social care, mainly foster and residential placements, some relationships, that's around family violence and divorce, benefit payments and criminal justice. So that's the group with no problems. This is the group of children who were, colloquially you'd say they were a pain. They were a pain to their teachers, they were a pain to their classmates, their behaviour was difficult, but they didn't reach conduct disorder threshold, caseness. And that's the conduct disorder group. Now, the big bit of that column is purple. That's criminal justice. It won't surprise any of you. You're all experts in this area. These differences, there's a 17-fold difference between the right-hand column and the left-hand column when you adjust for baseline covariates. These differences underestimate the true impact. There are lots and lots of things we haven't measured, we couldn't measure. But you can see here then over the course of 17, 18 years, huge costs associated with what I think you would say was an untreated disorder. The second study is called the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development, and there's one feature which all study members had, which is none of them went to Cambridge. In fact, none of them probably even visited Cambridge in their lives. It was a Cambridge University study of a group of people in South London. Boys from a very poor, generally poor background in South London. They were followed up, they are continuing to be followed up into their adult years. Some details of the study there, I won't go through those details. The study is now led by David Farrington, many of you will know, a very active criminal justice researcher. Now, what we did was work with those data as well. And I'm going to show you the results, not for service use, but for employment experiences. And these differences I show you are adjusted for baseline characteristics, and I'm not going to show you the detailed analysis. What we did first of all was look at the probability of being in employment, and we distinguished two groups after analysis. There were a group of boys who were described as troublesome, which really means they had antisocial behaviour, effectively conduct disorder, although no formal diagnosis was made. And in their teenage years, between 12 and 16, they had a criminal conviction. So they're called delinquent. So the group who are troublesome delinquent, both conduct disorder and conviction effectively, are in purple. The rest of the group are in green. So you can see that those who are in that category have a lower chance of being in work at age 32. If they are working, they have lower earnings. When you put the two together, their expected earnings or income is much lower. So the first example I showed you is the higher costs in terms of services. The second example is saying, if we look wider than this, there are big impacts for the economy and clearly for the economic well-being of these individuals. Now, what we also did in this study, as I said, was adjust for covariates, and one of those covariates was what you would call social exclusion. So within this group of relatively poor families, those who were poorest did worse. So there's a clear equity issue, equality issue there. Now, a very crude bit of analysis. Let me take those two studies. The left-hand column in blue is the service use associated with the most disabled group, those with conduct disorder. The bit in green is the annual estimate of the lost productivity. So that left-hand column is the cost of what you could call untreated mental illness. The cost on the right-hand side is the highest estimate that we've got in England of a parent training programme. So I've taken the highest cost. Compare the two. Now, that's not published. It would need a lot of work before it was published. If parent training was effective for only one child in 5, and if we're not too worried about time discount is whether you want things now or in the future, but if it's only effective for one child in 5, that looks quite an attractive investment. Now, we need to do this analysis properly, but I'm just trying to show you that the cost of some of these interventions is relatively modest. Question 4. Is there an evidence base on the cost effectiveness of interventions? Now, what do we mean by cost effectiveness? The core clinical question I started with is, does this intervention work? Does this new drug work? Does this psychological therapy work? Does this team-based approach to working with a family, does it work? Now, if the answer is yes, or the answer is probably yes, then you can go on and ask the second question, which is the economics question. And the economics question is what Norman described as terrible but necessary. Is it worth it? Is it worth spending money on that intervention? It would be very easy to design an intervention that was going to be effective for most children. It just might cost a couple of million euros per child. It's easy to develop interventions that are effective, but not to develop interventions that are effective and affordable or cost effective. And so the economic question is balancing the effectiveness with the cost. So I want to add in a note here. Contrary to what you've seen already, economists are not interested in costs. Economists are interested in cost effectiveness. Now, if I wanted to be an accountant, and I'm pleased I'm not, I would only be looking at costs, but I'm not an accountant. No economists are accountants. They are interested in what you spend and what you achieve, the cost effectiveness. So we have to look at the effectiveness side as well as the cost. So what is the evidence base? How good is it? A group of us did a systematic review a few years ago. We found 14 studies worldwide that could be called cost effectiveness evaluations in the child and adolescent field. 14. Now, of those 14, I would say that probably 8 or 9 would not get published today. So most of those, many of them were very poor quality. So the evidence base then was very poor. Progress since then is encouraging. There are some new studies. There's a very nice study in the BMJ from a group in North Wales looking at parent training. I know of other studies that have been submitted. There are lots of studies underway. Things are moving forward, I think, very well, and there's work on prevention as well as on intervention. But this is an incredibly small number of studies. It's a tiny number relative to the prevalence, to the needs, the disability, to the damage, whatever you want to say, of the population. And it's an especially small number compared to the literature in other areas of mental health. It's good, if you go up 2 or 3 bullet points, it's good that we've got more studies underway, but go into schizophrenia or depression or dementia or bipolar, and there are many, many more studies underway. Children and adolescent mental health is falling behind. So I gave you 5 questions at the beginning. And the answer to the first 3 questions was yes, economics is relevant. Yes, there are economic impacts in childhood. Yes, there are economic impacts in the life course. But no, there isn't much evidence. So what do we do now? And my final slide is just to suggest what we do now. I think, first of all, we need to tell decision makers that economics is relevant, but it isn't everything. We did some work earlier this year on dementia, a big report on dementia with new estimates of prevalence, new estimates of cost, looking at the distribution of services, the availability of drugs. It got huge media attention. It got big attention because we had a big cost number in there. The journalists were interested in the cost number because it was easy for them to remember, £17 billion. So we have to remember that decision makers can easily pick on costs, tell them it's only part of the story. We need to make sure that everyone knows that economic impacts in childhood are large and that they range widely across different parts of society, different budgets. And they persist into adulthood. And I cannot understand how Europe can afford these enormous costs. These are costs not just in terms of budgets, these are costs in terms of damaged lives. We need to tell clinical researchers to bring economists into their teams. We need to tell economists to be understandable, because some of my colleagues are not. And we need to make sure that decision makers act on the results. Thank you very much.